Okay, thanks for clicking there and joining me for our conversation with Arnold Kling, who is an economist and has a Substack page and writes on it regularly, I think daily actually, about economics and policy, or the polity, I'll say. He was once an economist in the last century for the Federal Reserve and Freddie Mac. He had a recent Substack piece which caught my attention, our attention at the Giving Review, the title of which was "The Nonprofit Brand," about which he had some things to say. And we'll talk about that in a bit. But first, why don't we just speak briefly about what, in layman's terms for me, what does an economist for the Federal Reserve do?
Well, I actually worked for several different sections. I never stood with any one section for very long. The Federal Reserve has many things that it worries about. Every central bank worries about being able to have a liquid market for its government's debt. We all know that the Fed has to worry about inflation and unemployment, and that in turn generates all sorts of worries. But it also worries about the stability of the banking system, the competitiveness of the banking system. It worries about international finance. And it even worries about like the back office operations of the payment system, so that when you cash a check, that you actually get the money that you're supposed to get. So there's so many worries, and so there's a lot of stuff for economists to think about.
Yeah. How about Freddie Mac? We hear about Freddie Mac, people like me, layman, all the time.
Yeah.
What is it, and what do economists for Freddie Mac do?
Okay, well, Freddie Mac buys mortgages, sells securities. The mortgages can default, the securities cannot. So it's taking some risk in the middle there. And there's a lot of challenges with managing risk. And so economists are expert on incentive systems, and they also know about uh, something called option pricing, because defaulting or prepaying a mortgage involves an option.
Yeah. What I'm going now right to the your Substack. What do I get to read about on there from you if I subscribe?
Um, I'm concerned with all sort of aspects of human interdependence, as I call it. And so sociology, psychology, politics, economics, and I try to tie them together.
So on nonprofits now, what role should nonprofits play in the economy and well, in America, as opposed
Okay, well, I think a very naive view of a profit-seeking businesses versus nonprofits is that the profit-seeking businesses are takers and the nonprofits are givers. And I think that's not the correct way to look at it. I think the most useful way to distinguish them is that a profit-seeking business has to survive by pleasing customers, otherwise it won't make a profit. And a nonprofit has to survive by pleasing donors, or else it won't get money. And that understanding, I think, is important. As in terms of what role they should play, I wish they were playing a role more like 100 years ago, when they provided relief to people, sort of a form of social insurance. Uh, and I think that was really the best role for them.
there's a term thrown about now among people who try to pay attention to these issues, working charities. Uh,
Yeah.
those are the groups that should be helped, as opposed to politicized groups or something else for
Yeah.
essentially for-profit hospitals. But
Yeah.
are you what are you okay with that term? Is that what you mean, or would you draw a distinction with a working charity and what you were just describing? Or
I think that's close.
yeah,
Yeah.
and who fits in these categories? You mentioned in particular, I think, in your piece, universities and hospitals.
Okay.
Many.
So one way to think about it is, sort of who really supplies the money. So you could have a grassroots organization, which, churches are kind of a classic example. And when ordinary people supply the money, typically ordinary people end up being the recipients. So sort of ordinary people who've fallen on hard times are the typical recipients of a grassroots charity. And I think that's kind of the old-fashioned, the best model.
Hmm.
Then you have the wealthy donor charity, and there you're more likely to get some sort of elitist type of thing being, a vanity project. And some of these are good. I mean, Andrew Carnegie's library is probably a good thing, but uh, they can just as easily be vanity projects and spend a lot of money on fancy dinners and things like that. And then the third category is government supported nonprofits. And that's kind of the most dangerous of all from kind of both perspectives. That is, government ends up being expensive and not necessarily getting the results it wants. And then the nonprofits end up lobbying to stay in business as opposed to solving the problem.
And there you're making reference to a direct government, really actual subsidy of a nonprofit, a check or whatever.
Yeah, yeah.
What about tax incentivized charity? Is that skewed towards the wealthy, or is it possible for what I'll now call working charities to benefit from a tax incentivized deduction?
My guess is that the tax deduction is kind of built into church charities, right? Government has always wanted to steer away from taxing churches. But somehow that's became expanded and includes things like universities. So, several years ago, I went through St. Louis, which is where I'm from originally. And it seems like half the land or half the better land is now controlled by Barnes Jewish Hospital, Washington University, and St. Louis University. And that's clearly a tax distortion and just a general distortion.
Mhm. Is there a distortion? This is a clumsy way for me to segue, but what about politicized nonprofits, contributions to which are deductible? They're exempt. And I know they might be small, but what would the complications there be, if any? Should the whole the pool of tax money be used to incentivize that under the name of charity?
I guess, yeah, I would be trying to narrow the scope of the tax deduction as much as possible. I mean, maybe, try to restrict it to churches or something. Um, in some sense, almost all the nonprofits that do anything with respect to government end up being political in some sense. So it's hard to draw a line, around political versus non-political. I know that legally they try to do that with, what's a 503C or whatever, but I would be trying to draw the line much closer to churches and not so close to political.
Yeah. Uh, I think you consider yourself a libertarian.
Yeah.
There are some on what I'm going to call the populist right who are paying attention to issues surrounding this matter. I use the term, oh no, there's a deep state, there's a deep
Yeah.
nonprofit. Is that overstated? I mean, your piece was about an article in American Affairs by Jonathan Ireland about nonprofits in cities and what's happening there. Uh, but are populist conservatives who are critical of a politicized or not deep nonprofit state, is that overstating the problem or the challenges?
Well, I was just reading something this morning. I think it's by Noah Smith. I could be wrong, but arguing that it's progressives who should be most upset with the way that particular organization that Jonathan Ireland highlighted was operating. That progressives should want good government, not government that gets distorted and sort of and made inferior by outsourcing to nonprofits that don't seem to do the job.
Yeah. What could be changed? You said narrow it, right? I'm now just trying to drill down on
Yeah,
that. Maybe narrow the exemption to, I think
yeah.
you said churches. How would one go about narrowing the use of or abuse of, or opening the path towards the abuse of uh, exemption and deductibility. What would the to-do list be for a policymaker who's trying to implement your thinking there?
I guess I would try to reduce the prejudice against profit-seeking firms. So the corporate profits tax is very popular, but it actually ultimately is the issue of who pays it and who bears the burden of it is not so clear. People somehow think, oh, there's this rich uncle, a business is a rich uncle that can just afford to pay, and so great. But in fact, um, economic analysis shows that it can affect all sorts of people, especially workers. So uh, sort of a more economically sensible tax system that creates less of a distinction between the profit-seeking and non-profit sector. We try to reduce that difference as much as possible.
Right. Okay. You wouldn't get rid of the exemption, or you wouldn't. You
I
just
get,
want to preserve it.
I don't think again, I don't think you can with regard to churches without opening up issues of, are you creating First Amendment problems? But I'm not familiar with the law in that area. It must be very difficult because, if you draw the line at churches, then you create a strong incentive for someone to declare himself a church.
Yeah.
Uh, so
Yeah. Well, and
that's
then try to
very interesting.
define politics. Uh,
Yeah, right. Yeah.
so it's inherent, it's inevitable that a nonprofit with any government aid would tend towards politics,
Yeah.
and that may be happening.
Yeah.